Do you have a hypothesis for why we've done such a bad job working in the education space in America? Because I obviously, I mean, you know what I do for a living. I care very much about this problem, and I too consider it to be of the utmost importance. I can't think of anything more important to be talking about than the problems in education and the things that are available to fix them for individual families. But it feels like in a lot of ways it's not, like, people don't have a huge sense of urgency around it, and there's not nearly as much competition in the market trying to build alternatives than one might expect when one starts to look into the enormity of the problem and the enormous opportunities that come along with a huge problem if you can get it right. Is it primarily a regulatory issue? Is it an apathy issue? Like, do people just not care enough? Is it not something that's being talked about enough for people to even realize the severity of the problem? Or do you feel like there's a lot of urgency in the space and it's just really hard to do something? I have my own hypotheses about this, but I'm really curious, like, you're deep in the weeds on it. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think there's three components. The first is that it's become political. And so saying things like we need to fix our public school system or our public school system is failing our kids, I think these are objective statements that are backed up in data that someone of any political persuasion could say, could mean, and would be very sensible to care about. Unfortunately, that's become politicized. And so any substantive conversation about this quickly moves to politics, which I think is sort of extremely suboptimal for problems that you want people to solve just on their merits or just from kind of first principles. Two, the incentive structure is just totally upside down. And so you could look at it from like a classroom basis. Teachers are not incentivized to raise the ceiling for kids. They're not incentivized to help kids get ahead. They're incentivized to focus almost exclusively on the floor to make sure that it's all about kids on grade level. And so they're going to spend all their time getting as many kids up to grade level as possible. The incentives on a per school basis are also totally upside down. People rarely get fired at the administrative level for poor performance. Schools that aren't doing well get more money. And so the incentives on the school level are totally upside down. And so this is like the classic, Charlie Munger quote, like, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. The incentives in education are just completely upside down right now. And then finally, I think people totally underestimate, people talk about regulation in education, and they totally underestimate how much of the rest of it's not just like the education regulation. It's all this other stuff that has been very carefully architected to make it extremely difficult to compete. And so this is stuff like land use, local zoning, different types of approvals that are required to launch schools from a state and local level. These are things that you don't think of it as like education regulation. You don't think of it as like a Department of Education policy, but they're very carefully engineered to ensure that it is extremely difficult, and in some states almost impossible right now, though we're changing that, to launch new schools. And that I think is something that is sort of very misunderstood. Is you can, there's all sorts of emphasis on things like school choice and funding and making it easy for kids to attend schools outside of their district. It's all great. We're not, not like opposed to any of those things. But when the rubber meets the road, it's like, hey, if you're a teacher and you have an idea for an awesome school, can you actually get that school off the ground and serve families in your neighborhood that you know and love legally and operate? And in a lot of cities in the US, the answer to that is like, yes, but you need to have a couple $100,000 for lobbyists and lawyers, and you need to probably have 2 years of your life to give to try to get this thing off the ground. And I think that's insane. And so none of these things are accidents. None of these things are just coincidences. And I think that it's sort of a very underrated part of this whole equation, and something that we desperately need to fix. And Primer is working on fixing, and has already made a lot of progress on at the state level in some states. But desperately needs to be fixed, not just for what we're doing, but for anyone who wants to try to build better options for families.
How do you think about inverting the incentive structure in the schools that you're building? Like, what is, and not just for you too, but on like more of a meta level, what should the incentive structures be for education as a whole? And then how are you implementing them into the network that you're building?
I have this idea that I would love to fund. I was actually talking with a school district about this, a fairly large school district too, which is, could you privately fund a different compensation plan for teachers and administrators for a year or two? and carefully craft a set of very aggressive bonuses and incentive-based pay for different outcomes that you wanted to test. And you could do it at a per school level, you could do it at a district level. And the general framework would be like, invert sort of like rather than focusing so much on the floor, focus on the ceiling, and have, teachers not as worried about this idea of like, I gotta get every kid on grade level, things like that. And they were actually really excited about it. And I think for like a lot of these districts, if you with $5 or $10 million, you could probably create for like 2 or 3 years, you could probably create a really exciting program for teachers and administrators. So I would love to run that test at some point, because I'm pretty convinced that if you talk to teachers, like their incentive structure, there's like basically no incentive, like financial incentive for them to create any sort of outcome. It's all just like basically flat pay. And then, you get a progression, like salary progression every year, whatever the union's negotiated. There's very little incentive for like specific outcomes to happen. In many cases, we're effectively relying on teachers. Thank God most of them are like altruistically motivated, because they have to spend their own money to like, do things for kids, and they're staying after school to help kids and stuff like that. But I think there would be an interesting test that you could run where you basically just tried this in a district and see what happens. At Primer, what we think about is how can you create a sort of culture where the high status things to do, both from a teacher level and a student level, are the outcomes that you want. So like every school says they want like a bunch of kids to like, go to good colleges or get good grades or whatever. But culturally, the high status things to do at these schools are be good at sports or bully other kids or, date the most attractive person or whatever. And all those things are, fine. I'm not anti any of those things. But there's a great essay about how humans are status thinking monkeys. We're all constantly looking for what the status signals are and trying to understand the status landscape of where we are, and then we modify our behavior accordingly. And so I think a lot about how do you create a culture, both for students and for teachers, where the high status things to do are one-to-one correlated with the outcomes that you say you want as an organization. And so I spend a ton of time with teachers and microschool leaders, and in Slack or on Zoom calls, sort of like reinforcing and congratulating and making a big deal out of things to increase the status of the things that we're organizationally prioritizing. And then with students, the same thing. And so if I'm, on site in a micro school, I'm constantly looking for the signals of like the things that the types of things that we really want to reinforce, and then trying to reinforce the behaviors. And again, these things are not novel, but I think that if you can be consistent about that from top down in an organization, you can actually create meaningfully different outcomes. And then we do things like teachers' compensation changes based on how many students they recruit. And so a key input to unit economics is enrollment. And so teachers at Primer make more money if they teach more students, because it's more work, versus in the public school system or the private school system, you just get a flat offer, and as many students as they can cram into your class, they'll cram into your class. And so there's a lot of ways like that where we're trying to align the business's incentives financially with the teachers' incentives. And so we're still, in the early stages of figuring out what that looks like long term. But at every turn, we're trying to make sure the incentives are as aligned as possible with Primer's long-term success and student outcomes for microschool leaders, which ultimately is going to be how we win.
There's a graph that I've shared on Twitter a couple of times it starts in 1970. I think it goes through to like 2020 or something. And it shows at the bottom, like the reading and math and science test scores just like basically flatlining, while the cost of educating students is just skyrocketing. There's so much inefficiency in our system. It's getting worse. And one of the things I also really love about what you're doing is you think really economically about the problem and the solution. Like a lot of people come at education from a pedagogical standpoint. They have a set of hypotheses around what they think a good education should be, and they take issue with the failings of the system, and they're trying to build something better. And you obviously have that too. You have a really clear point of view around what you think a child's education inside of Primer should be. But you also have a really clear sense of the economic bloat and waste. And this is again, a very open-ended question. But I'm just very curious about how you think about the possibilities of reallocating the incredible amount of money that we're wasting on education. Like if we're freeing kids up from the public schools, we're able to build alternatives that are meaningfully competitive in the free market for significantly less. What are some of the possibilities that start to open up around the places that we can innovate, the things that we can build, what the education system might be able to look like if we're not just wasting tons of money on bureaucrats that are really doing very little to help kids in their education and arguably are impeding them pretty dramatically.
Yeah. There's always like a funny, every time one of those articles drops that's like, new school budget, really, a new like district budget released, and like New York's going to spend $37,000 per student or whatever. It's not, I don't know if it's the real number, but one of those articles drops. It always ends up in our Slack, and like there's always like people from the education team like, oh Lord, if we had $37,000 per student, like, do you know what we could do? Like, just dreaming about like all the things that we could accomplish for that. So I think, I'm hopeful that what I think the bull case for all this is that because you need a functioning public school system. You need a public school system in the U.S. that is ideally delivering way better outcomes, way more efficiently. That's happening now. And the best case scenario, I think, is that some of the things that are working really well in the private models that are being scaled then can be taken, and the public school system can get a lot more efficient. Because it's not really, there are some districts that are underfunded. I think that's a fact, but most districts are not underfunded by any sort of rational evaluation of the budget. It's just that the capital allocation is totally out of whack. And so if you can start to show a model where, like, my view is that most of the capital should be going to the teachers, the microschool leaders in our case, and then second most should be on the sort of tertiary things that you need to do for students so they can have a great experience. And if you can start to show a model where that sort of basic premise generates results, I think you could have a lot of exciting stuff happening in the public sector schools if you had innovative states that were willing to try things that previously would have been like off limits from a public perspective. So I'm pretty excited about the idea that some of these, like the things that are working in the private sector could be actually go back and help make the public sector more efficient. The other thing that I'm excited about is I think that families, the anecdotal sort of like stories of families are starting to become more than just anecdotes. And I'm a pretty firm believer that we need a lot more data being shared, because right now it's basically like, you have these anecdotes like, oh, I got access to this school and it was like this, it changed my life. And those are very powerful stories. They are, emotional, they're moving. But what you need is data of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of students who, shifted into a different educational paradigm, and then very specifically demonstrate with real data what that did for them, whether that was for future life outcomes, future salary, future family quality, future how you want to define quality of life, academic outcomes, college, whatever you want to do. And so I'm excited for more of that data to come out, because I think that's ultimately how we should be judging success. And you can debate which of those are more important, obviously. But I think that as more of that data starts to come out and it's less anecdotes and it's more data, you will have more people taking it seriously from the public side. And then hopefully there'll be willingness to try these models that are way more capital efficient and I think deliver way better results.